Today's presentation is going to be discussing the birth of geology and the foundations which have created the science which we know today. One of the central players in the formation of geology is a man called James Hutton, and we'll be discussing some of his ideas and how they really formed the science of geology. We'll also be discussing some of the history of what was going on in the scientific community prior to Hutton's revelations and what they thought of the creation of the planet and how they saw the Earth. So what was going on in the scientific community prior to James Hutton was that the church had a very strong hold on what was denoted as correct in the scientific community, and they continued to have influence after Hutton's revelations. It just so happened that a lot of his thoughts contradicted what they believed and were then proven to be scientifically accurate later on in the course of history. One of the major things that was going on within the scientific community is that the Earth was considered to be very young. It was considered to be around 6,000 years old, and this date was conjured up through the records of births and deaths and marriages which were listed in the Bible. And they really took all those dates and lined them up into a timeline and traced it back until the first one. And that first transaction is when they considered the Earth to be created, which was around 6,000 years prior to the time which they were alive in. And another way that the church heavily impacted the scientific community was that any change to the surface of the planet was considered to be caused by a catastrophic event. So things such as Noah's flood and the Tower of Babel and ancient wars, these were what was considered to be shaping of the planet and what was considered to have created a lot of what the people in this time saw as the layout of Earth. And of course, this perspective also lends to the belief that the Earth is stagnant or still and it is not changing. And a lot of this came from having a perspective of human life as the central measure of time. And if there were not changes that could be recognized from the birth of a human to the end of a human, then there just weren't any changes going on. And this perspective is one that Hutton definitely challenged. But as you can see, the church definitely played a large role, and Hutton's revelations contradicted a lot of this. And James Hutton himself is a Scottish naturalist and chemist. He spent his life trying to discover as much of Earth's history as he could, and a lot of his perspectives are the foundation of geology, which is why he is considered the father of modern geology. He wrote a book called The Theory of Earth, which outlined a lot of his perspectives and ideas and his theories on the creation and cycles of Earth and how the processes really do work. And he did publish that in 1795. This slide has a picture of him. That is James Hutton. And his main principles were those of uniformitarianism and this thought that the present is the key to the past and the past is the key to the future. And this idea that time is much larger than human life, and that the processes of Earth are much greater on such a larger scale than the people of that time had previously envisioned them to be. Hutton spent a lot of time observing Hadrian's Wall, which was a wall built in Scotland by the Romans around 122 AD. Now, the wall had experienced very little weathering or wear and tear since its creation, and this led Hutton to think that if this wall weathers this slowly, then how much more slowly would mountains weather or be built or change? How much larger of a scale do geologic changes occur than man-made? And so this led to the conclusion that planetary changes are actually occurring gradually and over time and constantly on the planet. There is no moment where the planet is stagnant. We just can't see all of the changes because they occur on a different scale than we live. Raw materials are constantly being reformed and rebuilt and destroyed, and volcanoes erupt, mountains build, seafloors spread, and all of these contents, they are moved and they are maybe in a different state of being or a different phase, but they are all still present on the planet. And he estimated that the Earth is much older than what the scientific community at the time had been thinking, where they thought 6,000 years old. We know today that the current estimate is that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, so they definitely underplayed their estimate. And on the right of the screen is a picture of Hadrian's Wall. A little bit more depth on the present is the key to the past, just to get a little bit of a bigger picture on that. What this is saying is that current cycles and processes of the planet act as a doorway or a window into realizing what was going on the planet in ancient times, in the ancient world. And, excuse me, these cycles, we assume through the process of uniformitarianism that they act with the same intensity and the same mannerisms as they did back then, so they are consistent, they hold over time. And this allows us to get a clearer picture of what was going on in the ancient world. We still don't know, obviously, all of the things, but this perspective did allow for a lot of changes in what was previously perceived as what was going on in ancient times. This concept of worlds upon worlds again speaks into the reformative and destructive cycles of raw materials, and just there's so much history stored within the core of the planet. And we're going to get to an example of this in a minute, but that history over time, as our technology has improved and as our perspective has improved, has allowed us to much more accurately depict a picture of some of the earlier times of Earth and the processes which have gone on since the beginning of time. A really great example of the worlds upon worlds principle is that of sedimentary rocks. Sedimentary evidence is really pristine in terms of relative dating because the rocks layer or stratify depending on the age of their deposit, and their composition tells a lot about what is going on in the world at the time. And this is just a really excellent example of how history is stored within the core of our planet. And this ability to map and depict what composition is in the rocks or in the air at the time, it really gave us a large picture of how the composition of the atmosphere has changed and how the composition of the soil has changed. Not only did Hutton's perspective give us assistance in analyzing old evidence, but it also applied to a lot of future compositions as well. Obviously, the concept of geologic time we've brought up a couple of times throughout the presentation, but just understanding that the world works at a slower pace because these changes are so large, it just provided a really different scale, a different way to measure time, more scientifically accurate, and it really did propel a lot of that thinking. Plate tectonics is another way that Hutton's concepts really laid the foundation, because you've got the earth is changing, and the earth had changed from the times of ancient worlds. We know that the plates have changed, but it is very interesting to see how and when, and his foundational thoughts of the present is key to the past, and the earth continually and gradually changes. They really laid the foundation for that. And geology is an established science now, and he played an extremely elegant role in bringing that about. These are the sources I used in this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something about the foundations of geology. Thank you.